Hi, folks. Welcome back to Ellie Not So Confidential. This is Dr. Scott. I am here with my co-host and bestie.
Hey, it's Dr. Shiloh.
I have no idea what day it is. I don't know. I don't know where I am. I know I'm in a room somewhere surrounded by pillows with a computer.
Yeah, I've just been in this closet for like 3 months. So,
Seriously. Well, now you know what my experience was like for the first 16 years of my life.
Oh my God. But I'm pumped. That's a nice.
Seriously, no, it is. I'm sure that we are not the only ones feeling this. This is like certainly a nationwide, if not a worldwide phenomenon of just feeling completely out of sorts.
Well, plus it feels super weird because you and I literally have not recorded an episode in over a month. So,
and yet we've been incredibly busy.
Yeah. Oh yeah. People know we've been busy. So
yeah, we've been doing all sorts of stuff for the show, but this is great. We're back in the saddle. This is really cool.
I can't believe it's taken us this long to get to this topic, because this is literally the meat and potatoes of what you and I were doing together when we met and what I did exclusively for a number of years. So today we're going to be talking about internet facilitated sex offenses specifically.
And I think probably the thing that has thrown us off, Shiloh, is that we talk about aspects of it so much and how it interrelates to so many other episodes that we've recorded, but we haven't specifically drilled down into this particular area.
Right. Yeah. It in the giant umbrella of sexual offenses, this definitely is its own little niche. And I think I got to see that when I went to work for a company that for 3 years, literally, it was just internet offenders. And it's really interesting to step into it. And really, we're going to talk about what crimes these are, the psychology behind it, of course. But when you and I were in internship, we worked for a private company that contracted with parole and probation. And so people who'd been convicted of these offenses would come back out into the community, and then we would do their assessment and their treatment. And so that's how it sort of works in the criminal justice system, is that they are funneling them out to companies who have experts and expertise just in this area. So I'm really interested to know just kind of your takeaway from that year. What were some of the big moments for you? And I'm sure we can kind of sprinkle this throughout the episode today as well. But what was the experience like for you? Because you left and kind of went on to other things.
It was a really valuable experience. It was a valuable experience in that I knew by the third year, like the last year of academics in my doctoral program, I knew that I wanted to work in forensics. And I was thinking about more family forensics. And I knew that for pure financial reasons and some interest in the subject, I was going to go work in a prison facility just because I knew that there would be a job and I knew that there would be benefits, which I needed. I needed cash, I needed insurance. And I also was fascinated by the population. So, but I remember, and I think I've talked about this several times, going into the interview with Lisa. Was it Lisa? Yeah, Lisa and Leah, who were running the program at the time. And just being really transparent with them, saying like, I've applied for a lot of places. This sounds really fascinating. I know nothing about this population. And Leah, being really fantastic and saying, I don't expect you to know anything. That's why you come to an internship of this intensity, is so that you can learn, and you can learn with a format and a program. And so I really walked out of the interview. I went into the interview not invested in getting the position. I walked out of it really wanting the job, really wanting the job. And also, I've joked about before, not having any idea, because I'm such a, dancing monkey song and dance guy. I usually come out of interviews thinking, yeah, I charmed the shit out of them.
Right. I got it.
And this was one where I was like, I have no idea how these two people feel about me. And they were just completely stone faced. And apparently they are with everybody. I mean, that's just,
Yeah,
Having,
exactly. I had the same feeling. I was like, damn, I did really well in that interview. I know I did. I had a great answer for everything. I think my experience came through, but they gave me nothing. And that was hard. It's just a hard process when you're vying for an internship anyway.
yeah. But then, following through with what the question you posited is, I just started peeling an onion that really, I was not expecting to go to some places. I mean, I certainly was challenged in my compassion for aspects of humanity, because we were really seeing some very ugly stuff. I mean, not that we were exposed to the material, but with people who, a good third of the people that we were treating had no remorse or no insight, or didn't care to develop any insight, didn't care to, develop any compassion for the people that they had victimized. And that was really surprising to me. And then also, facilitating a group of sex offenders and showing them the documentary Chicken Hawk and having them discuss
Oh gosh, yeah.
aspects of it, and then realize that, like, I actually myself had an experience with someone that really, should have used better judgment and should have been a better person. And, so I came away from it. I remember going into Leah and going, okay, just opened up a memory into my attic, and I need to process it with you.
I still show parts of that documentary in trainings of Chicken Hawk, because it's such great examples of some of the cognitive distortions we're going to talk about today that true pedophiles have.
And I think most of it is on YouTube. So if anybody's out there, and it's rough. I mean, it's not. It's rough because it'll challenge you. You're there, and this is one of the sort of the old school documentaries where they basically just turn on the camera and let people talk.
Yeah.
And boy, Operation Let 'Em Talk really digs a hole. They just, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It was very intense, but also, like, there were just the funniest, most surreal moments too. And I know we've talked about other interns we were there with, and the characters that we worked with, and staff and things like that just kind of made it the best experience.
Yeah.
From the terrible location, the terrible building, to just really going through this experience together. And I don't know. It's a fun time to look back on all these years later. But
I think also you and I being a little bit older than some of the grad students in doctoral programs, me substantially more than you. I just really felt like I was coming into like a really adult situation. Like, this is
same. Yeah.
This is really adult. This is really professional. It's radically different from working in entertainment. And it just felt real. I mean, entertainment, which I had some really great jobs. I mean, and I cherish those experiences. And you're providing a product, you're creating something that really influences people's lives. I mean, I felt really lucky because I worked on some really very cool projects. And, but to come into working in a forensic population and realizing, like, oh wow, we are really trying to prevent further harm from happening. That just sort of takes it to a different level.
Yeah, I think for me, it really sparked just wanting to learn more, and wanting to be a part of that learning, like be a part of the research. And so it just lit a fire under me to do my part in this world and dive into it, and then hence like getting the job with them afterwards and being able to do that. So yeah, that's kind of setting the agenda for today. So let's talk about what internet facilitated sex offenses are. And like with so much of crime, I think there's the technology to do types of crime that have always been done. It's just now we have a different platform to do that in. So offenses, they're primarily child victims. I think we can, if you kind of hold that in your mind. So also, I guess this is a good point kind of for a trigger warning to say,
Yeah, definitely.
we are going to be talking about crimes against children. We are going to keep it as clinical as it needs to be, but also give you information. There's going to be no gory details or details about descriptions of offenses necessarily. But we will be using proper terms to sort of get across to you also how horrific this is, because we don't want to sugarcoat it. We used to also call them hands off offenses, meaning like this wasn't happening in real life. There was no touching. We moved away from that because it started to have this creepy connotation of, hands off, hands on crime. You sort of pictured what was going on in your mind. So then we moved to calling them contact or non-contact offenses. So anything happening over the internet generally starts as non-contact, meaning there is no physical in real life contact, but sometimes it does move to real life contact. So what we're talking about here is, as the legal system and a lot of the laws still have in their wording, child pornography offenses. You will hear Scott and I talk about child pornography in a different term, child sexual abuse images, because this is another thing that through the evolution of looking at these types of offenses, we don't want to label child pornography to sound so dried down to like being a product. We want to remind people what it actually is. It's images of children being sexually abused.
It's a lot like using the term child prostitute.
Yes.
Child prostitute or child sex worker, that's a misnomer, because any engagement of a minor in sex work is rape.
Right.
No matter if they're quote unquote consenting to it. It is not allowed. It is illegal. So what we're trying to do is not sort of cheapen the terms anymore. We want to be very descriptive about the illegality and how wrong it is. And that's why we use these specific terms.
And it really helps in treatment as well when you're trying to get through to someone, because they have built up such a wall and a disassociation with this, that it is just a product. It is just pictures, instead of really thinking, no, there are victims and stories behind these. So it helps treatment wise as well, but just professionally, child sexual abuse images is the term for those images. Child pornography is still how it reads in charges when we're looking at like penal codes and things like that. So under child pornography, you can have possession of it. You can have production of it if you're someone who's actually producing it, or you can be charged with distribution of it. And generally, these are federal crimes because the jurisdiction of the internet, well, the internet didn't have a jurisdiction. So usually crimes over the internet are prosecuted federally by the FBI. This is usually how it's divided up. People can be charged with all three of these, perhaps, or maybe it's pled down to one or two of these. And so possession would be if someone was found in possession of them, right? Like it's in possession on their computer. Again, we're talking virtually, not necessarily having hard copies, although a lot of these collectors we will talk about then download them onto their computer, copy them, put them in binders, code them as a collection. It can take on that realm as well. Production would be that's a biggie. That's people who are actually abusing children and filming it and or putting it into production. The distribution one is really interesting because you can have passive distribution or active distribution. So this is going to give you some groundwork onto the scale of the world of child sexual abuse images and how these offenders sort of work within that world. So passive distribution might be something like they have a server on the dark web and they upload their collection of child pornography just so anyone else who wants to come and grab it can come and grab it.
So what would be the motivation for somebody to do that? What do you, off the top of your head?
A couple of things come to mind. In this world, it's really part of a sick game to have the skill and to have the challenge of trying to be able to collect as much as possible.
Right. It feels like a merit system. Like, I'm going to show you and sort of get status in this world is by showing how large my collection is.
Yeah. Yeah. It might also be to try and see if, if like paying it back. So if someone has uploaded their stuff and maybe you've taken some of their images that you're sort of sharing in this world. So I think there's a lot of different motivations, and we might get into that a little bit more when we talk about the ways in which they do this. So that would be passive. You're just kind of putting it out there, and if someone takes it, they take it. Active distribution would be making contact with somebody else in this virtual world or group, and they're asking you for something specific, or you're trading specifically with that person. So with child sexual abuse images, something that was really popular on the dark web for a while were these series of images of the same victim, and they would usually name it by, that victim's first name, unknown if it's their real one or not. So an example would be the Vicky series. Someone, just like as if they're trading baseball cards, might say, hey, I have, 7 of the Vicky series images, but I don't have all 10 of them. And they would sort of put out an ad for that or ask to trade images. So that's definitely more active when you're soliciting to gain specific images, or here I'm looking for this specifically, almost like putting out an ad and then seeing if someone answers that. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're explaining it really well, and like there's so many different directions we can go, and I'm not gonna go down the rabbit hole, but I do want to put a bullet point in saying that what you and I learned very quickly in working at that facility was that it wasn't just about sexual urges. It was this Venn diagram of overlap. And for those individuals that we encountered that had sort of an OCD / collector / hoarding part of their characterological makeup, that became obsessive for them. Like, I got to get those last 3 of the
Absolutely.
Vicky. I have to have them. I have to have the entire Angela series. So there's a whole other part of the brain that's being stimulated besides just sexual urges.
Yes. And we're going to talk about the pathways of how people get there, and that will be a part of it. Okay, so that's pretty much the types of charges you would see for child pornography. Now, local agencies are able to arrest people for these charges and prosecute them locally. So it's not all just federal anymore. I'm sure you've heard of like local police forces or their task forces putting together big investigations and sort of going after people on a local level. So that definitely happens more now. The next type of crime in this area that I want to just hit on is solicitation. So this is one of those cases in which they meet online, yet it is for the means of an end of getting this child or this underage adolescent to meet up in real life for sex. So
it's not just it's not about just I'm logging on so I can just hang out and chat with some kids and chat with anybody. It's like, no, I'm going hunting. Right.
Yes.
Yes. I don't even like saying I'm going hunting. Like,
I know.
The individual is going hunting.
Yeah. So there can be the solicitation to meet up in person, which is pretty common of what we'll see with these guys. Sex tourism is a whole other thing that we'll talk about in a moment, because I want to talk about that in its own category. Or the solicitation of images. They could be interacting with children or adolescents online and asking them to send pictures of themselves. So it could be, in a way, virtually through this interaction, they're helping produce child pornography. So solicitation can be a couple of different things, but this is what you think about when, especially as a parent, you're scared of some creep contacting your kid on the internet. Okay. So cyber exhibitionism falls under, again, this sort of a parent's worst nightmare of someone contacting your child. And essentially, this is exhibitionism, but via the computer. So there's a webcam involved, and the offender, excuse me, the adult offender is showing their genitals or masturbating online. And there's a child victim on the other end that's seeing this. The flip of that would be cyber voyeurism, where they are using the victim's webcam to be able to see them in stages of undress or asking them to engage in sexual activity on their end. And then the offender is watching it on their end of the computer. Both terrifying, both disgusting. And, I'm sure this is going to haunt parents. This episode's going to haunt some parents for a while.
Well, one takeaway from that particular point is that there are many options for preventing that from happening to your child or to a child or to even to you. And it could be making sure the most minimal level is, if you're using Zoom or Skype or whatever, know when you are completely logging out of the program. And sometimes just because the little light at the top of your laptop screen or your computer screen that indicates a camera being active, just because that light is off doesn't mean that the camera is off. And that could be a glitch in the software, whatever recordings or whatever software system you use. Everybody really should be more aware of this. I mean, there have been incidents where what was the big one? I can't remember what state it was in, but it was a school principal who was in on it with the IT guy, and they basically were hacking into all of the teenage girls' school-assigned laptops.
Great.
The school was handing out laptops, and he was just basically, grabbing images of these girls because they would leave the laptop open while they were going about their business. So, or you can just get a Post-it and put it over, or get a Band-Aid and put it over the camera when you're not using it. And they even have these little adhesive plastic sliders that will cover the camera. Mm-hmm. I highly recommend you do a little research on that, listener.
Yeah, there's a ton of safety precautions and privacy precautions you can take. However, I did see an article this last week that online predators are very aware that children are using the internet way more right now during COVID.
Right.
And are online and are comfortable being online, even, the little kiddos who are just having class through Zoom. And so they're really, with anything, especially with any pandemic, and you and I have talked about bad guys taking advantage of that, they know children are online more right now. So there is something to that. And there's just, unfortunately, always going to be someone taking advantage of the situation. So, okay. So I mentioned a little bit about sex tourism. Now we know, I'm sure we all have in our head, what we think about with that, somebody leaves and goes to another country to engage in sexual activity with a minor, where perhaps it's legal or perhaps it's easier to do, or they won't get caught. That can fall under this. I've had clients that set up sex tourism trips to other parts of the world, and the second they get on the plane, the FBI rushes in and arrests them. And they do fall under some of these federal solicitation, non-contact offense categories. But there's also webcam sex tourism, which is, I just remember hearing about this and how horrific it was. But
yeah, this is something that disturbs me.
Yeah,
it all disturbs me, but this one particularly is because I know where you're going with this, and the implications are really frightening.
They're really frightening, and I'm going to link a video for you guys to be able to see how this is being battled and how countries are coming up with innovative ideas of how to catch some of these individuals. But essentially, there are countries where there is so much poverty that families actually are allowing children to engage in some of this virtual cyber sex, whether it's voyeurism or exhibitionism. And individuals over here in the United States and other countries are paying those families to be able to utilize their children for that service online, which is horrific that some families think that they need to do that. But essentially, these men are contacting children in other countries that have webcams and paying for online sexual services.
And sometimes it goes even further than just directing the child into exhibitionism or directing the child via the cam into acts. Sometimes the parents are actively like, once there are incidents where parents are realizing like, oh, I can make money out of this, and they start seeing it as just their, they may even engage in forcing their children to do these activities that are being requested by the viewer, which is just incredibly disturbing. It
is. It is. So there's a research entity, I think they're out of the Netherlands, they're called Terre de Ooms, and they decided to do this really cool thing, and this is what's going to be in the link that I'm going to put in the show notes. They developed a CGI 10-year-old Philippine girl, and she was able to engage with these online predators without them even knowing that she wasn't real. And so they were able to capture thousands of IP addresses and pass that on to the authorities. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. It's so scary how easy it was to be able to just put this CGI girl up there, and she was getting solicitations like within minutes.
So I remember what was the name of the AI or the CGI?
Was it like Sweetie or
Sweetie?
Something like that?
Okay. But here's the question I have for that is, they weren't able to get, when they capture the IP addresses and then they start investigations, they didn't actually get the perpetrators for that particular incident because a real person wasn't involved. But did they get them for other things that they had on their computer?
Well, so it started an investigation. I don't know what happened with all of these, but they're able to say, hey, these are folks you probably want to look into. And I bet you it's enough to at least get a search warrant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, or start monitoring their streams. Yeah, their threads.
Because if they're not getting what they want out of this one, they're on to the next one. So it's not as if it's so sporadic that you're not going to immediately find something if you start looking into this person. But they identified adults from more than 65 countries and passed all that information on to the authorities in those countries. So campaigns like this and innovation like this, I think, is really exciting and has to be done to battle some of this online sex trafficking that's happening, because it's pretty terrifying when you start thinking of it in numbers of how many, primarily men, obviously, around the world or just here in the United States are into this, are doing this. And I remember when, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, 10 years ago, I was told like how many IP addresses throughout the United States had accessed child pornography. And it was mind blowing. I mean, we can talk about like what child pornography is and how that's categorized, but hundreds of thousands of IP addresses throughout the country are accessing child pornography at any given time. So let's get into a little bit so those are the main categories of offenses we're going to talk about here, and sort of the psychology, even divvying it up a little bit more. But why is this such a big thing? Why have the numbers just exploded the way that they have? I mean, literally, law enforcement could not keep up with it once they found out, this is what's happening, and we know how to start going after this and fighting it. So I think definitely what we famously refer to as the AAAs with this, it's to access child pornography or to engage in some of these other behaviors. It's anonymous, right? You can jump online, be fairly what you think is anonymous. And I'm not saying this is real. I mean, obviously you can be traced back in lots of different ways, but the perpetrator has a sense of anonymity to where they think they won't be the ones to get caught, and they're sitting behind a computer screen, which makes a lot of people bold for a lot of different reasons.
Right. And so anonymity lends to disinhibition of actions, behaviors, thoughts.
Yes. Yes.
You're creating your own little cognitive distorted bubble to live in.
Yep. So there's anonymous, there's affordable child sexual abuse images can be obtained for free. No longer are the days of having to give your credit card necessarily to a website to access child pornography. There is so much, especially if you're savvy and can navigate the dark web, that you can just get for free. So there's the affordability piece of it, as well as accessibility for all the reasons that we've sort of talked about already. If you can navigate and you want to find it and put in the time and effort, it's going to be accessible for you. So going back to, maybe how this is just a crime that existed before even the internet. Back before the internet, people would have to go to great lengths to obtain child pornography if they weren't producing it themselves. You would maybe have to order something from overseas. You would have to actually get it in the US mail. You would have to pay for it with a credit card or however. And that's why a lot of the charges, especially federally, have such steep consequences and sentences, is because it's sort of based on this old system of using the U.S. mail, which will basically get you locked up in federal prison forever if you do anything nefarious through the U.S. mail. But it was much more labor intensive without the internet back in the day. So that's why we kind of see this, just the numbers explode once the internet comes into play here. And law enforcement's response has tried to keep up with that.
Yeah.
It's like with anything, especially virtual crime, that they are just sort of playing catch up. But just to give you some numbers, so these are older numbers, but between 1998 and 2006, the online enticement of children increased by 400%.
Oh my gosh.
So imagine any type of crime increasing 400%, and then all of a sudden, holy shit, do we have the investigators? Do we have the manpower? Do we have the technology to even start attacking this?
Well, and also the idea, I think, of all those points, do we have the technology, is almost the primary point from my point of view, because government and law enforcement agencies generally are behind the curve on individuals' use of technology. They may be, obviously that we have CIA and FBI, and we have other government agencies that are on the cutting edge of like forecasting and staying on top of sort of big world events. But when it comes down to the micro level, where you're saying an individual can easily access these things for free now, and know how to mask their trail by using, virtual networks and other things that they can teach themselves. Yeah, that's where it gets to be really difficult, because it's nothing but catch up, and it's barely ever catch up, except when it's somebody who gets so cocky and has so many images that it's just a big waving red flag online.
Right. Yeah. So during that same period of time, U.S. attorneys handled 82.8% more child pornography cases. So a lot were getting filed as well. So I have some numbers here from the FBI Innocence Images Initiative, and they were looking at between 1996 and 2005, which would be the internet coming into its prime, essentially those years. They found over a 2,000% increase in open cases, and then over 1,300% increase in convictions. So yeah, they were opening a ton of cases, but then they're also doing a decent job with sort of keeping up on it and being able to make their cases. But, this is due to more law enforcement online and finding ways to shape their investigations online with better training. And I remember this period being working in law enforcement, like I remember going to a MySpace training, like you have to train your officers because they might not know what some of these things are. But if you're a sex crimes detective, you better go to a MySpace training in 1999 or whatever to learn what it is, so you know how to collect evidence,
Right.
even if it's not just trying to keep offenses from being committed, but on the investigative end and creating and collecting evidence. I think multi-jurisdictional task forces were also part of their response. They realized, okay, we can't just let the FBI handle everything. They were overwhelmed. But how can we come together in a county if we're seeing this sort of explode or something like that? And then, of course, new legislation. The laws, which we know take forever to change, really had to catch up to accurately prosecute individuals for online sex offenses, rather than just using like, oh, well, what's on the books that's old, that sort of feels like it catches this.
Right.
Either people would slip through the cracks because they wouldn't meet the criteria for any crime because it wasn't laid out, or they were getting sentences that didn't necessarily match the crime because it was based on old data.
Yeah. And, going back to what we started off with about takeaways from our training, is that sort of having to patchwork together, law enforcement having to patchwork together, like, okay, well, how can we get this individual? And the problems with that is they're playing catch up. The legal system is playing catch up as well, because they're in many cases, they're spreading a very wide net in some of these cases. It is right. Possible, and it's not the majority of the cases. It's certainly not the majority of the cases. But even you and I saw some where we were like, clearly this person stumbled into this world. They had 2 images that came as a part of another set of completely unrelated images, and yet they're awaiting trial and maybe going to prison for a long time.
Right. We saw those anecdotal cases.
Yeah, and there are not a lot of them, but anecdotal cases are concerning for anybody, because you're in that position of like, wait, this could happen to you if you step the wrong way.
Sure. You download a zip drive that says adult pornography, and if you download that zip drive and now there's 2 images of children in there, and maybe that was bait, maybe that was put out there,
Yeah.
And literally someone in that situation could be facing 20 years in federal prison.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for explaining that, because it certainly was not the majority of the case, but like Scott's saying, we've seen it.
Yeah, I remember one of the feds that we talked to was explaining to us that really, there's a benchmark of the number of images, and I'm not going to say what that benchmark is, but it was, I don't know if I would call it high or low. It's certainly not low. I don't know if it'd be high compared to like the really chronic collectors, but then we would see an example. I would work with a young individual, like a 21-year-old, terrified 21-year-old who's a computer geek and had 3 images on his computer that clearly came from something else. He's not meeting any of the criteria for the way we look at pedophiles or hebephiles.
And the thing is, Scott and I can assess these individuals. And I know as I continued to do this work, we really tried to get more data about the evidence collected to see sort of what the percentage ratio was, if you will. Like, okay, how many of their images are adults and how many are children? Because it helped me as a clinician to determine if this person had a deviant sexual interest in children. And we can do that assessment, and maybe I say, no, from what I find, from my expertise, from all of these assessment tools, this person doesn't meet the criteria for pedophilia, for example. The feds have a federal guideline system where it doesn't matter if there are certain checkboxes and criteria in the crime itself, the federal judge has to give them that sentence. The
Okay.
judge can't say, oh, well, Dr. Shiloh said, this isn't where your deviant sexual interest lies. I'm going to consider, what your defense is, blah, blah, blah. It's mildly interesting to the court system. It's something that we ended up using for treatment more often. Here and there, when the probation officer is sending our report in, it might say, they're low risk for a future sex offense, but as far as just standard guidelines, it didn't matter much. So when we look at non-contact offenders or online offenders in comparison to the contact offenders that Scott and I have talked about in the past, so your child molesters and individuals even who offend against adults. Online sex offenders typically have very little planning to their offense. The offending takes place over long periods of time, and we will talk about like the grooming that happens. And again, they're sitting behind their computer, so they can kind of take all the time in the world if they need to. They're not getting in their car and putting all this effort into it. We do see that there are periods of abstinence. So there's sort of this cyclical effect to where they might engage in looking at child sexual abuse images, but then may get so disgusted with themselves that they say, okay, I'm going to stop, like I can't. It reminds me very similar to somebody who has a pornography addiction.
Yeah.
How they kind of go into cycles of abstinence. I've had clients who like took their computer and set it on fire and, threw it in a trash bin. Well, we both had one. A dumpster.
Yeah. Like, yes, that's going to fix it. That's going to erase everything. You threw your computer into the dumpster.
But I say that to illustrate that they swear they're done with it. Like, this is it. I'm literally taking this thing out of my house. And maybe if they didn't set it on fire, a couple of days later, they're like, oh, I wonder if the trash has been picked up yet. I'm going to go get my computer. We're also seeing younger offenders because the internet is so easy to access that I've had tons of clients on my caseload who started viewing child sexual abuse images when they were children. I mean, I'm talking 9, 10, of course, up into teenage years, which is its whole other interesting aspect because adults are kind of gross to them at that age. And so they're looking for peers. So it technically isn't really deviant because they're looking at age mates. But then at some point they grow up and they keep looking at the younger aged images. So that's an interesting phenomenon with this as well. And it seems like online offenders tend to have more hypersexual tendencies when it comes to various cyber sex outlets. Like they are maybe engaged in more than one of these behaviors that we've talked about, or they're sort of doing this binging that you just can't really do with contact offending necessarily, which good. I mean, I'm glad it can't be done so easily in the real world, but
it's also about that difference between reality versus non-reality, or the virtual world, is that there's a different set of neurological and physiological things that happen when you're having intimacy with another person. And I'm talking adult to adult, legal, consentive. And then if there was like a contact offense, there is a physiological response that's happening. And that physiological response is very different from what happens when someone is viewing and immersing and saturating themselves in pornography, because it's like somebody smoking an entire pack of cigarettes just over and over and over again. Whereas, you don't have the physical stamina to do that in the biological world, but in the virtual world you do. And unfortunately, you are literally rewiring your brain by doing that. You're rewiring, in the same way we talk about exposure to pornography for children can give them, especially young men today, gives them a very, very skewed view of what intimacy between adult consenting partners is like. It's this overblown, it's an unrealistic view of what sex is like.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. So the potential victims here, these are specific to the United States, these statistics, but and these are a tad old, so they may even be higher. 93% of adolescents and teens go online. You have 80% of kids 5 and younger going online at least once a week. So again, kind of going back to that is probably even higher with the current pandemic situation. And 1 in 25 children, and we're looking at ages 10 to 17 here, have received an online sexual solicitation in which the perpetrator suggested offline contact, like let's meet up in person. So that's, I mean, 1 in 25, and I'm guessing it's, even more now, because I want to say that those are probably 7 years old, the statistics. So internet child pornography, should we get into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, let's do this before we take our break. Can you touch on that, and then we're going to come back with examples, and we're going to talk specifically about cognitive distortions. Would that work?
Yeah, let's do that.
Perfect.
So the content of child sexual abuse images has a disturbing trend to it. Over half of it, 52%, involves prepubescent children. 42% is pubescent, so pubescent or post-pubescent. So think teenagers or adolescents who have secondary sex characteristics in their development. And then 6% involves infants or toddlers, very young. Typically, the majority of child sexual abuse images involves a female victim. And now the trend is of younger children and more explicit acts being performed. The majority is amateur, and it's not that any of this is produced at a professional level like we would think of like an amateur
as adult
film.
Videos, yeah.
Right, as adult videos. But there are countries and entities and people in this world, unfortunately, that this is all they do, and that it has a very produced feel to it. So that's sort of how they divvy up amateur versus that. And so the majority would be images that are sort of taken of family members and then sort of starting to pass those around. So it is amateur in that it might be a harmless photo, but then it gets into the wrong hands and starts getting passed around of a child in a naked or in a sexual pose or something like that, or an adult type pose. So still images as well as the awful videos that are out there are generally amateur. So that's what's making up the content of what's out there. Of course, there is everything that you could possibly think of. It's interesting for me to say that typically it's prepubescent girls that are depicted when it's out there, because it's really interesting that it's of note that the majority that there's prepubescent girls involved as opposed to boys. And Scott, you'll probably remember this when we were doing risk assessments on these offenders, that one of the criteria, one of the risk factors that we would look at is whether or not the content was male or female, or was it a male victim or female victim? And for those individuals who have a sexual interest in males, for male sex offenders who have a sexual interest in male children, it actually puts them at higher risk for reoffense. That's when you see more of the deviant sexual interest, the pedophilia being involved, is when male victims are the target for these perpetrators. But 42% post-pubescent, again, those are going to be teenagers. This is kind of one of those other interesting areas, right? Because we've talked before in our paraphilia episode way back in 2017 about how the average adult normal male is attracted to post-pubescent teenagers. If she has developed breasts and she has curves and she has pubic hair and is post-pubescent, that is something that is physically attractive to heterosexual men. There's nothing wrong with that. You just can't touch until she's of age. But those physical characteristics are something that's normal for men to be attracted to.
Right. And they're supposed to be, our engagement in social and cultural rules is managing the balance between understanding that there's a biological reproductive imperative that is built into our physiology, and balancing it with this person, yes, although this individual would be attracted to this underage individual, it is inappropriate legally, culturally, emotionally. You're basically, your dick is doing your thinking in that moment, right?
Right. And I think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's just basically that's it. It's like, remember, you're not actually thinking. You're just being driven by hormones and sort of the most primitive part of our mammalian brain, which should be balanced by executive functioning in the front lobes of your brain that says, no, this person is underage. This is not an option to engage in this behaviors with, and which is actually really interesting because it links up to the number of sex offenders who have head injuries as well, like sort of that head injuries to the frontal lobes.
And I point this out because I want people to understand the reality of the pornography that's out there. And when I say 42% are post-pubescent, I want you to understand that there is a good chunk that is not just the worst of the worst that we think about with little children. And when you're sort of, as we're diving into the psychology here, I want you to think, okay, there are people, yes, there's a big chunk that are primarily interested in prepubescent children. That sexual deviance right there. But then there's also a subset of men who are normally sexually attracted to teenagers, who are seeking out this content online. And you and I have seen, we had individuals on our caseload that just had adolescent porn.
Right.
It was just post-pubescent. With the federal laws the way they are, it's really tricky. I've seen even articles about cases like this where, because the federal age of consent and cutoff for child sexual abuse images is 18 years old, you can have a couple in, let's say, Texas. I think the age of consent is 16 or 17 in Texas. You can have a 16-year-old in a relationship with a 25-year-old that is perfectly legal. But if she sends him a naked picture of herself, it could be possession of child pornography at the federal level.
Wow.
So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't match up, that legally has to be worked out. And I think, to wrap up here before we take our break, our job as clinicians was to say, what is going on here? What are the motivations? Is it a paraphilia? Is it a sexual deviance that we have to work on? Or is it more situational to where we have to get this person, like you were saying, to start thinking and making right decisions and understand what the law is, and that you cannot do this even to just indulge yourself sexually behind your laptop.
Exactly.
And hopefully not to reoffend in the future in either of those cases.
Yeah. And then just illustrating the difficulty in that when we have an umbrella of federal rules, and each state gets to be making its own decisions about, and there are cultures in each state that reflect that. Texas, and there was a big case in Alabama, my home state, several years ago, where Roy Moore, a politician who, clearly had a significant history of interacting as an adult with underage as young as 14. And the people that came out in support of him were using biblical text. I mean, just like the craziest cognitive distortions to justify that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Just because it's a biological drive doesn't mean it's legal. That's what we should break with.
Right. And it's so complicated with the way that our system is. And as you and I laid out before, it's sort of a result of the laws trying to catch up with technology. And so here we are with all of this stuff layered over each other. And then you and I as clinicians get to just try and figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, folks, we're going to take a break, and we will be right back with some examples and a little bit more learning about cognitive distortions. We'll come back with a little bit more education about cognitive distortions and how they play out in the role of sex offenses. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking in. This was a really long episode. So long, in fact, that we realized that part 2, coming back from the break, has to be an entire other episode. But don't worry, the episode is going to go right up within 1 to 2 days after the posting of this one. So thanks for sticking with us, and we'll see you shortly on LA Not So Confidential.